Good morning. Appreciate Steve filling in for me last week while I was out of town. I'm also going to be out of town next week. I'm not sure what will happen for class necessarily, but someone else will be here. So in the meantime, since I've been gone and our classes have been kind of sporadic, we're going to cover 3 chapters today for the sake of time. And also, it could be, depending on how you look at it. If you didn't hear me, asked if it was a punishment. One reason is just for the sake of time, kind of get the ball moving a little quicker here, but also because what we're covering today is the Sermon on the Mount. And often what happens with the Sermon on the Mount is you go through every detail of it, and really you could do an entire series on the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, we've done that here before. Jim, a few years ago, did some online videos going through the Sermon on the Mount. You might remember those. He called them the Mountainside Minutes, and he did that for a couple years, I think, off and on. And so there's a lot that you can unpack in the Sermon on the Mount, but it helps if we look at it with a wide lens, and if we can understand sort of the big picture of what it is that Jesus is conveying in this sermon. And so it is one sermon, it's one unit. And so we're going to look at this from sort of a wide-angled lens this morning. So, is this working? I think this battery might be dead. It's not the battery. There we go. Thanks, guys. So Matthew 5 through 7, it contains what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And you may remember through our introduction, we covered how in the Gospel of Matthew there are these 5 major discourses. These are big chunks of passages, often more than 1 chapter's worth, often 2, or in this case 3 chapters, where it is a big chunk of teaching from Jesus. In this case, it's 3 chapters. It's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And if you have a red letter Bible like I have, then just about every word is read when you go through this. And so this is the first out of these 5 major discourses. And so one thing to remember is, as we're going through the Gospel of Matthew, one of the themes that Matthew is drawing out to us, because remember he's writing to what we understand is a primarily Jewish audience, is the idea that we are sort of sitting at the feet of the master teacher, getting teachings from him, teachings more so from Matthew than we do from the other gospel writers. And so this is something that I think Matthew is clearly trying to portray to us, this idea of Jesus as the master teacher. And so this is the first out of these 5 major discourses. And one thing that's interesting, we didn't quite go over this in our last study, because we ran out of time. But this discourse, what Matthew was recording, what Jesus says here in these chapters, in this sermon, it's prompted by the ending of chapter 4. And so this is where we actually left off in our last study, Matthew 4, starting in verse 23. I hope that's not too small for you to read. It says, "And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan." So the ending of Matthew 4 is segueing into Matthew 5, and it's segueing into what Jesus is going to say. And so we see here initially that he's teaching in their synagogues, and he's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. We saw earlier in that chapter when Jesus began preaching, he was telling them to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. His message was the same as John the Baptizer's message. And so this is the gospel, the good news of the kingdom, the fact that the kingdom was at hand, the kingdom was near, and Jesus is ultimately going to usher in that kingdom. And we see that he's healing these diseases and afflictions among the people. And so what's the result of that going to be? Well, naturally, his fame spread throughout Syria because of the things he was doing. He was doing these miraculous things. He's healing people. He's healing their ailments and their afflictions. And he's also teaching. We'll see at the end of the Sermon on the Mount that they marveled at Jesus' teaching because he taught as one who had authority. And so he's teaching, he's doing these miracles, he's healing people, and his fame spreads throughout the region. And we see later on that because of this great fame, crowds begin to follow him. And so this is the moment where we see all of a sudden Jesus is drawing crowds. And now he's got an audience. And when you have an audience, what are you going to say? Well, every good preacher, when they have an audience, they're going to find something that they're going to say. And Jesus is going to do that here when we get to the sermon. So here is the structure of the sermon. This is kind of just a rough structure of these few chapters and sort of the idea that Jesus is conveying here. And this is the structure of how we're going to go over this all in one lesson, Lord willing. So he starts with the Beatitudes. That's the first part of the sermon, sort of the introduction to the sermon, where he speaks about the blessings that come. Then there are two parables, and there's one charge there later on in chapter 5. And then he gets into the main body of the sermon, the thick of it, so to speak. And he covers primarily three topics. He covers the law, which is the rest of chapter 5. He then covers righteous acts, which is the beginning of chapter 6. And then, sort of an umbrella term, he covers these various different social issues as we go through the end of chapter 6 and into chapter 7. And then Jesus will conclude this sermon with three warnings at the end. And so that's the structure of the sermon, and that's going to be the structure of our study this morning. And so we're going to start by looking at the Beatitudes. These are the blessings that come at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus first starts teaching here on the mountain. The word beatitude comes from the Latin word beatus, which simply means blessed. Some people will say, well, a beatitude is an attitude. And that's kind of true. Being blessed can be an attitude, but really that's not the idea here. It comes from the Latin word which simply means blessed. And the reason for that is because when you go through the Beatitudes, Jesus repeatedly draws out these blessings. For example, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, verse 3. Verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, and so on and so forth. And so there's all these blessings that Jesus outlines for us here. The Greek word that is used, that is translated as blessed, is the word makarios. And the literal meaning of this word is to be fortunate or happy because of circumstances. And so some, instead of translating this as blessed are, fill in the blank, some would rather say happy are, and then fill in the blank. That perhaps does a better job of conveying the idea. Because it's one thing to say that you're blessed, it's another thing to be happy. That reflects our own attitude. And it is in particular because of the circumstances that they're in, which is interesting because as we look at the Beatitudes, some of the circumstances don't seem like they would bring happiness. And we'll talk about that. Thinking about this, the opposite of a blessing, and this is something that Matthew is going to draw out for us, in particular when we go to Matthew chapter 23, the opposite of a blessing is a woe. And so here in Matthew 5, he says, blessed are these people. But then later on, he'll say, woe to these people. In other words, these people are happy. These people should not be happy. They should be upset. They should be angry over the circumstances. They should be upset. These Beatitudes follow the same general formula, and you'll notice this as we go through, where he'll say, blessed are, and then he'll name the group that's blessed, and then he names the reason for the blessing. So he states the blessing, and then he explains it. And so, for example, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's the group that's blessed. That's the group that should be happy, the poor in spirit. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the reason why they are blessed, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Many of these blessings seem contrary to worldly expectations. And this is something I think that Jesus is doing on purpose, sort of to draw our attention to some of these things. And here's a few examples of this idea. This isn't all of the Beatitudes, but these are some examples of ones that you might not think would be the case. He talks about in verse 3 the poor in spirit. He talks in verse 4 about those who mourn. In verse 5, the meek. In verse 6, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And in verse 10, also in verse 11, those who are persecuted. Well, why in the world is it a blessing to be poor in spirit? That doesn't seem like that would be a blessing. That doesn't seem like that would be a reason to be happy. Well, Jesus elaborates on that. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Whether you're poor, whether you're rich, the kingdom is a great thing to have. And in this case, it goes to the poor in spirit. Verse 4, blessed are those who mourn. Well, what is there to be happy about with mourning? The rest of it, for they shall be comforted. The comfort that comes with that mourning, that is the blessing that comes with it. Verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meekness is sort of that idea of withholding that strength. It's strength under control. It's not weakness, but it's strength under control. Sort of like when you have, Jim uses this example sometimes, when you got that high-powered sports car and you're cruising down your neighborhood and you're going 25 miles an hour. That baby can get up there if you put the pedal to the metal, but you're driving meekly, hopefully, as you're going through your neighborhood. Hopefully you're not running over mailboxes or kids or anything. Verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We think about being hungry and being thirsty. That's usually an idea of being impoverished, and that's not a good thing typically. But in this case, it is a good thing because those people will be satisfied. And notice what it is they're hungering and thirsting for. It's not food, it's righteousness. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness shall be filled. He goes on to say, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. That's actually an attitude that Jesus is going to touch on later on when he talks about social issues later on in this sermon. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And then blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We think of being persecuted, and a lot of people are afraid of being persecuted. And you can see the things going on in our nation, and you can see how we're kind of slowly but surely moving in that direction where persecution is going to become more prevalent. Well, Jesus says that that's a blessing. We should be happy when we're persecuted. And the reason is because of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom far exceeds any suffering we may have through these persecutions. And he goes on in verses 11 and 12 to say, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Here again, we have sort of a backwards idea for most people. The idea of it's a blessing when we're reviled and when we're persecuted and when people say false things about us. Jesus says our reward will be great in heaven because of that when that happens on his account. And so we have these kingdom blessings here at the beginning, the blessings that come from being part of the kingdom. Very briefly, are there any comments or questions on any of that? All right. Oh, Garfield?
I think one that's persecuted in the Bible, remember how Stephen was being stoned?
Right.
And he had a vision of heaven, you know? And it was a blessing to him.
Yes, Stephen, that's a good example in Acts chapter 7. He he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father in heaven, and he's getting persecuted. He gets stoned. He gets killed. He's the first Christian to be killed because of their faith, and that was a blessing for him, even though it may not seem like it, right? You had something, Daryl? That is the question, isn't it? Some consider that a blessing. I'm not one to openly welcome persecution because it's not pleasant, right? But sometimes I think that might be what the church needs. All right. Next we come to the two parables that he gives here in Matthew 5, and then there's a charge at the end. And so a parable, we'll cover more about what a parable is in particular when we get to chapter 13. But a parable is sort of a real life illustration to convey a truth in a general sense. And so Jesus, there's a whole chapter in chapter 13 about parables of the kingdom, right? But he gives a couple of parables here in this chapter. The first parable is that of being salt of the earth. He likens us to being salt. And so he says in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." There's a lot that you could say about salt, because today salt has a lot of different functions. You think about salt, it has healing properties. I remember when I got my wisdom teeth taken out, I had to gargle with salt water because that helped aid in the healing of the wounds in my mouth. Salt has, it gives you sodium. If you're deficient in sodium, then maybe you need a little salt in your diet. Maybe if you have too much sodium, you need to take a little out, right? Salt enhances taste. Salt can be used as a preservative. Salt, you think about when they salt the roads, it can be used to help put some friction on the road, so on and so forth. But Jesus, in particular here, emphasizes the aspect of taste when it comes to salt. And so you could have different applications for those different functions of salt, but Jesus specifically touches on its taste. And so that's what we'll talk about here. Specifically, if you have salt and it loses its taste, then it's useless. It serves no purpose. The purpose that it has after that, in Jesus' words, is to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. It's no good except to be trampled on. And so what does that say about us? Well, it tells me that Christians have a purpose in this life. Salt had a purpose. In that case, the purpose is taste. If it's not meeting that purpose, it's not good for anything. Christians have a purpose. I would say if you keep with the salt analogy, salt can be used to enhance food. That's the idea behind putting it on food. Have y'all ever put salt on watermelon? I've seen people do that, and I've never understood that. I haven't tried it, no. Okay. But it's an enhancer. It enhances our food. Well, like salt can be, Christians need to enhance our world. We need to make the world a better place. And you'll see Christian charities, and there's a lot of Christian hospitals and things of that nature that have made the world a better place. Think about individual Christians. What are you and I doing to make the world better? The way we do that is by bringing people to Jesus. That's how we do that. That makes the world a better place. So that's the first parable. The second is afterward, and these two parables are related to each other. And this parable comes in verse 14 and 15 of being light of the world. He says, starting in verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house." He goes on to say, I'll just go ahead and read it, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." So now he likens us to light. and you think about light and what the general function of light is, light illuminates things. If you're in a dark room, you need some light that you can see. Sometimes you get up in the middle of the night, and if you're not in your own home, like maybe you're away out of town, maybe you're in someone else's home, or maybe you're in a hotel, if in your own house you can maybe wander around in the dark because you have a general idea of where things are. But if you're in a hotel and you get up in the middle of the night and you can't see, you're probably going to bang your leg on something, or your foot on something, or your arm on something, or whatever, because you can't see. You don't know where you're going. You need light to shine and to illuminate these things, to show these things. That is the general purpose of light. And so the idea behind this is that light is not meant to be hidden. That kind of is counterintuitive, isn't it? It goes against what the purpose of light is. Instead, and this is going off of Jesus' analogy, you don't put it under a bowl, but you put it on its stand, so that it can not only shine, but that it can shine brightly and that it can illuminate the things that are in the house. And so we are light. And so Jesus says, don't hide your light. Be the light in this dark world. Illuminate this dark world. And one thing that's interesting to think about is the imagery that the Bible conveys of the contrast between light and darkness. It's often used in a dualistic manner where you have one thing pinned against another and they're opposite things. And it's often used in the sense that light is righteousness and darkness is wickedness. This is something that John uses a lot. You can read it in John chapter 1. He describes Jesus as the light, right? In 1 John, he talks about how God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And so if we say we have fellowship with him, but we're walking in darkness, we're lying, right? Because there is no darkness in him at all if we're walking in darkness. And so you think about the imagery with light and with darkness as you see it throughout the whole Bible. And what Jesus is conveying to us here is, in a dark world, we need to stand out. We need to bring things to light. There's the verse that talks about have no work with the works of darkness, but rather expose them. That's the idea here. We expose that which is in the dark. We shine our light so as to make this world better. And so he gives the charge to let your light shine. This is a dark world, and it, at least to me, seems like it's getting darker and darker. And so this world needs some light. And what this looks like for us, and this is the application that Jesus makes, is in the realm of good works. And this is interesting because we understand that good works don't save us. We're not saved by good works, but good works are still expected of us. Think about what Paul says in Ephesians 2. There's the whole thing in verses 8 and 9. You're saved by grace through faith, not by works, that no one can boast. But then you get to verse 10. We're created in Christ Jesus for good works. That is our purpose. That's not what saves us, but that's our purpose. And this is what Jesus is saying here. Let your light shine so that people will see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And this, of course, contrasts what he's going to warn about in chapter 6 when he talks about these acts of righteousness. He says in verse 1, be careful about doing your good works to be seen by other people. So in this realm, it's not to glorify ourselves, it's to glorify God. It's to bring others to glorify God. That's the idea behind letting our light shine. Ooh, I got to get going. Let's talk about the main body of this sermon. So there's 3 topics, and the first topic is the law, and this pertains to the Jewish law. This pertains, when you use the word law, there's different ways that can be applied. In this case, I think he's mostly referring to the Old Testament in its entirety. He speaks about the law and the prophets. That's kind of a way to talk about that. And so he's going to talk about the law, but he predicates this by stating, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets. For some reason, that's what some people might have been thinking, and that's what some people still think today. Jesus came to abolish the law and the prophets. He did not come to abolish them. Instead, he's coming, in his words, to fulfill them. And so what we see happening here as Jesus talks about the law, and he's going to cover various aspects of the law, things like murder and adultery and so on and so forth. What he's doing, he's not abolishing the law, and he's not usurping the law either. That's another thing that some people will say. He's challenging their regular practices. It's not the law itself, but it's how they practice the law. That's what Jesus is challenging. And so you'll see the formula that he uses. You've heard it said, and then he'll give some sort of quotation, either from the law itself or from their tradition. And then he'll say, but I say to you. That's not Jesus contradicting the law. That's not Jesus usurping or superseding the law. That's Jesus giving them the correct way to live out the law. This is talking about how they practiced the law. And so Jesus does not overthrow the law. He doesn't abolish it. He shows how it's fulfilled, and he's going to fulfill it himself. And so there's these various aspects of the law that Jesus covers. He covers murder, which really is about anger, as he clarifies. Then there's adultery. There's divorce. There's the idea of taking oaths. There's the idea of retaliation. And then there's the idea of love and hate and how those go together when it pertains to different groups of people. And so there's all these examples, and one thing that's interesting to notice is that sometimes Jesus will quote from the Old Testament directly. But then there's other times where he quotes traditions. And an example of that is in verse 43 of this chapter when he is talking about loving your enemies. He'll say, you've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I don't know about you, I've looked. I haven't found a place in the Bible where it says to hate your enemy that Jesus would be quoting from. That's Jewish tradition here that he's quoting from. Loving your neighbor's in there. But the idea of hating your enemy, that's not necessarily in there. That, though, was how they took this and ran with it. And so this is a tradition that Jesus quotes. And so, again, he's not necessarily usurping the law. What he's doing is he's combating the way that they practiced the law. And in particular, the Jewish elites like the scribes and the Pharisees and all of that. So, thinking about big picture, we're not going to go into some of the specifics here, but what's the idea in Jesus doing this? What's the idea in Jesus talking about the law? Because to the Jewish people, the law was pretty important. What Jesus is doing is he's combating the legalism that was plaguing the Jewish religion at that time. It was plaguing the Jewish religion. And Jesus is coming to combat that. And legalism, if you're not familiar, is the emphasis more so on obedience for obedience's sake instead of doing it for love's sake. They're doing it more to keep a list instead of doing it out of love for God. And so they were more concerned with the law than they were with the Lord. The law sort of became their God in that sense. They worshiped the law, essentially. And so this led to the appearance of piety on the outside, the appearance of righteousness, the holier-than-thou kind of attitude that you might hear some people say in regards to some Christians today. There's the piety, there's the righteousness that's on the outside, but the inside is evil and wicked and dead. And Jesus is going to draw that out when he calls the scribes and Pharisees whitewashed tombs in Matthew chapter 23. It looks clean and pretty on the outside, but it's still a tomb on the inside. It still has death in it. And that was like what they were. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's showing the right interpretation and the right intention of these laws, and then consequently how you put these into practice. And so what we see is that their legalistic approach missed the point of the law, and the point of the law ultimately was their hearts. And this is something that Jesus is going to draw out in Matthew 15 when he quotes the prophet Isaiah. They're giving the lip service, but their hearts were far from the Lord. The Lord was after their hearts, and their hearts were not in it. So that's topic number 1. As we get into chapter 6, the second topic are righteous acts. These righteous acts are the second topic. And this is just kind of a brief topic, but a topic nonetheless. And Jesus predicates this with a warning in verse 1. And the warning, he says, is beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. This is a symptom of the problem that we just looked at the beginning here. The legalism, the outer righteousness, despite the inner death. They were doing these deeds not out of love and admiration for God, but more or less for attention from other people. And this was a major problem for the Jews, in particular the Pharisees and so on, wanting to be seen, wanting to get credit from other people. And what we see is that they were more concerned about impressing others than they were about impressing God. That's their concern, is how other people perceive them, not how God perceived them. If they cared about how God perceived them, then they would have changed their ways. They would have done as John told them before, and to bear fruit in keeping with repentance. But they don't do that because they're concerned more about other people than they are about God. And so, as Jesus covers these righteous acts, he breaks this into three different acts. And the acts are traditionally the Jewish acts of righteousness. You have the act of giving, you have the act of praying, and then you have the act of fasting. And in each of these cases, Jesus, the basis of what he's talking about, he says you should do these things, right? In each instance, he says when you give, when you pray, when you fast, implying that it's expected that they did those things, and I think that we do those things. But in each case, Jesus instructs them to not make the righteous acts a public spectacle. You go on through this, and he says, when you give to the needy, this is in verse 2, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. That's kind of a ridiculous image, isn't it? You give to someone and you got trumpet players behind you, sounding off because you gave to the needy. That's just ridiculous, and that's apparently what they were doing. They made it a public spectacle when they did these things. They did that when they gave. They did that when they prayed. He says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. This is in verse 5. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. And then when he gets to fasting, he says, this is in verse 16, when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. They wanted people to know that they were fasting. They would disfigure their face. They would, on purpose, not present themselves very well. So when people asked, oh, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fasting. And then they were hoping people would praise them for fasting. They made it a public spectacle. What Jesus says here is to do these things in secret. Don't do these things to get credit from people. Do these things for God. And so thinking, for example, about giving to the needy, he says, but when you give to the needy, this is in verse 3, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do these things in secret because your Father sees in secret. You don't need to impress anyone else besides the Father. It's His opinion that matters. And so do these things in secret, and your Father will reward you. So thinking about this and thinking about righteous acts, what's the idea behind this? And obviously there's the idea of not making a public spectacle of these things. But does that mean we can't pray in public? Does that mean we can't contribute in public? Well, think about the intention behind our good works. That's more or less the root of this issue. What's your intention? Is your intention to give glory to God, or is your intention to give glory to yourself? Because he did say in chapter 5 to let our light shine so that others will see our good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. But he warns in chapter 6 and verse 1, beware of doing your righteous acts to be seen by others. And so the idea here is, who are we trying to glorify? Are we trying to glorify ourselves, or are we trying to glorify God? Are we doing these things for ourselves, or are we doing them for God? That's the idea. There's a scary thing that Jesus brings out in each of these examples. I'll read in verse 2. He says, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Notice this. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. In other words, they're doing these things to be seen by other people. That's exactly what they'll get. They'll get the praise from the people, but they're not going to get the reward from God. That's a scary thing. And so there's the expression, be careful what you ask for, be careful what you wish for. They're wanting to be praised by other people. That's exactly what's going to happen. And they can pat themselves on the back. But on that day of judgment, as we'll read later on, the Father's going to say, I never knew you, depart from me. That's a very scary thing. The third topic of the main body of this sermon are these various social issues. And really there's two issues. And each issue follows the same general formula. And so each will begin with the principle. The second issue is actually bookended, where you have it begin and end with the principle being stated. Then you have two parables that are listed, and then you have a word of encouragement in there. This is how each of these social issues is addressed. This is the structure of them. And so the first issue that he talks about is in regards to money and in regards to possessions. There's the general principle that's listed in verses 19 through 21, the idea of laying up treasures in heaven and not on earth, right? That's the idea. Then there's two parables in verses 22 through 24. The first is that the eye is the lamp of the body. The second being you can't serve two masters. Those are the two parables. And then you have a word of encouragement starting in verse 25. Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? And he goes on through this encouragement about not having to be anxious about this life, about the food we eat, about the things we drink, about the clothes we wear. He says, don't be anxious about these things. These are things that you need. Your Father in heaven will provide them for you. So don't be anxious about these things. Don't work yourself over these things. So he says, don't be anxious about your life and affording what you need, because your Father will provide them. But instead, this is the word of encouragement. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. That's the encouragement here. Don't be so concerned about these other things. Instead, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and these things will be added to you. Those things being the food, the drink, the clothes, specifically. So that's the first issue. The second pertains to our relationships with each other. And so this is segueing now into chapter 7. And so there's first a general principle. The idea of judging, which, by the way, this is something that people take out of context. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. So that's the general principle. People throw this in our faces sometimes. Say, well, it says to not judge. That's not explicitly saying we can't judge. That's saying we can't judge hypocritically. That's what that's saying. Because, as he says, the way we judge other people, that's how we're going to be judged. So judge other people the way you would want to be judged is more or less the idea that Jesus is conveying there. Don't judge hypocritically. In fact, later on, Jesus is going to talk about us judging other people. We're going to tell false prophets by the fruit that they bear. That's judging them, is it not? And so there is judgment that we have, but it can't be hypocritical. That's the idea in these few verses. So next time someone throws that in your face, tell them, well, this isn't about all judgment. It's about hypocritical judgment. Then there's two parables. In verse 3, he talks about the speck that's in your brother's eye and the log in your own eye. That's one example. And then the other example is giving to dogs what is holy and giving pearls before pigs. Those are the two parables here. And then he gives the word of encouragement. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. So there's this word of encouragement. The things you ask for, God will give them to you. Then we have another principle in verse 12. And you'll notice how these bookend with each other. In chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, it's about judging and not judging hypocritically. Then you come here to verse 12, and it's sort of the same idea. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. That's often called the golden rule. Do unto others as you would do to yourself, that kind of thing. You can see how these two things are related. Don't judge other people unless you're ready to be judged the same way. Do unto others as you would do to yourself. And so the way that we treat other people, that obviously matters. It matters especially in light of how our Heavenly Father treats us. He's giving to us, He forgives us, we need to forgive other people, so on and so forth. Now we come to the conclusion, and Jesus offers us these three warnings. I don't think this will take too much time. The first warning, enter by the narrow gate. This starts in verse 13 of chapter 7. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And so what Jesus is conveying to us here in this conclusion, in this warning, is that the direction that we're going in matters. The direction we're going in matters. You can't go north and expect to go south. You're going to go in the direction that you're traveling. And so here, Jesus presents us two paths, two gates, ultimately with two destinations and two outcomes. One leads to life. That's the narrow way. The other leads to destruction. That's the wide way. One way is easy, the other way is difficult. The way that's difficult, that leads to life. The way that's easy leads to destruction. So, are you willing to take the easy route and end up in destruction? Or are you going to take the difficult way and lead to life? Which way will you go down? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. So that's the first warning. The second warning is to beware of false prophets, or false teachers, as we would think of it today. And so he gives this warning, starting in verse 15, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Have you ever thought about that imagery? Someone who looks like a sheep, but really they're a ravenous wolf. They look like one of us, but really they're after our destruction. They want to consume us. That's the idea that Jesus is conveying here. And so, what Jesus is showing us is who we listen to matters. This is true of the ones who teach in a public way, those who preach in a public way, but it also matters those who we listen to in our private life, the people you seek counsel from, the people you might watch online, the people you might take advice from. Who we listen to matters. And there is some judging that needs to be done. And we judge by the fruit that they bear. Jesus says, you will recognize them by their fruits. And so, there's some judging that needs to go on here. And he'll go on to say, as we go on through this, when you get to verses 21 and through 23, what's important is doing the will of our Father in heaven. That's what we need to look for in our teachers and our preachers. That's what we need to look for, doing the will of our Father in heaven. Doing things by the authority of God, doing things by the authority of Jesus. If we're not doing that, then we have nothing to say. And then quickly, the final warning. Build your house on the rock. There's a lot of things you could draw out of this illustration that Jesus gives. There's the idea here of hearing and knowing the words of Christ. But that's not enough in and of itself. We need to do as he says. As he says here, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. You have a house built on the rock, you have a house built on sand. When the storm comes, when the rains come down, and the floods come up like the song, right? Which house is going to stand? The house on the rock is the one that will stand. And so hearing and not doing is like being a house on sand. And it's going to have a great crash. And as Jesus says, that's foolish. And so we need to hear what he says and do what he says. And we see the end here, the reaction. When Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. They marvel at Jesus' teaching because he taught them with authority. The king is here. He's teaching and preaching about the kingdom principles, being kingdom people, kingdom blessings. And that's the idea of this sermon. Thanks for your attention.